Dear all, thank you very much for attending this webinar, Harvest Management during COVID-19 Crisis in the Southern Hemisphere. What can we learn from it? During the next hour and a half, 5 experts from Argentina, Chile, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia will discuss the challenging situation they were confronted with the past 3 months. Now, please welcome Mr. Paulo Roca, Director General of the OIV, for a few welcoming words.
Well, thank you for your presence today, and thank you to the panelists on to this webinar on harvest management under COVID-19 conditions. And I would like to introduce you to the moderator, Antonio Graça, Head of Research and Development of Grape SA. In OIV, he acts as a secretary, scientific secretary of the Sustainable and Development and Climate Change Expert Group. And he holds a Master in Science in Enology. He is in the board of directors of a few institutions at the European level. And Antonio is the author also of several publications focusing on genetic resources, climate change, resilience, and precision management. I give you the floor, and good luck, good work, and I hope that the outcome of this webinar is very good for the sector. Thank you. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you, Paulo. Good morning, everybody. First of all, my thanks to the OIV for this invitation. It's an honor to be here today. And I would like to welcome all the participants, the audience, the speakers to this webinar. A few words before we start. The OIV is an institution of a scientific and technical nature, uniting governments of 47 member states across the world in its self-declared role to inform, assist, harmonize, standardize, and support the vitivinicultural sector. This is accomplished through a global network of more than 1,000 experts. The name of this webinar is Harvest Management during COVID-19 Crisis in the Southern Hemisphere. What can we learn from it? Historically, as you know, in the wine business, knowledge has flowed mostly from northern to southern hemispheres as more and more countries developed their own wine sectors. Today, the world of wine faces an unprecedented situation because of the COVID-19 pandemic. True to its role today, the OIV reverses that historical flow of knowledge by inviting experts from the Southern Hemisphere OIV member states to share their experience, insights, and solutions for harvest management under COVID-19 with the rest of the world. These experts are, and I would ask you to switch on your cameras as I mention your names, please. So we have from Australia, Tony Battaglene, who is the Chief Executive for the Australian Grape and Wine Incorporated. We also have from New Zealand, Jeffrey Clarke. Jeffrey is the General Manager for Advocacy and General Counsel of New Zealand Wine Growers. From South Africa, Yvette van der Merwe. Yvette is the Executive Manager of the South Africa Wine Industry Information and Systems, SAWIS. From South America, we are pleased to have from Chile, Aurelio Montes, who is the President of Wines of Chile, and from Argentina, Daniel Rada, the director of the Argentine Wine Observatory and also professor at the National University of Cuyo in that country. So Daniel, if you can hear me and you can switch your camera on also, we would appreciate it. Thank you. So without further ado, I am honored to invite Tony Battaglene to the floor, who will share with us his experiences during this troubled moment in his country, in Australia. Tony, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. And I will just, hopefully you can all see my screen. I will just move to the start of my presentation. So I guess I will not go into a lot of technical detail today over the issues we addressed, but I will leave you with the information to understand what we've presented and what we did in our country. For a start, my organisation is Australia's National Association of Wine, Grape and Grape Wine Producers. So we are not a government body, but we work very closely with government and we're recognised under the legislation as being the representative body for wine, grape and wine producers. And this becomes very important in the context of how we've dealt with the COVID-19 crisis. So the Australian timeline. The first confirmed case was identified on the 25th of January when a man returned from Wuhan was found to have COVID-19. We then, on the 18th of March, we had a fairly minor number of cases, but we understood the issues and a human biosecurity emergency was declared under legislation. And then Australian borders were closed to all non-residents on the 20th of March. Social distancing rules were then imposed on the 21st of March and state governments started to close non-essential services. I think it's important to understand that Australia is a federation of states. And we have 6 states and they each have a provincial government and then there is a national government over on top of that. But the constitutional ability to control health issues resides with the states. So from the 24th of March, we started to see border restrictions being imposed between the states. Now, of course, this has dramatic implications on the movement of personnel and the movement of product. However, we did cope with the human disease context of this crisis reasonably well, and we're now seeing restrictions being eased. So the government response was from the 3rd of March, we saw official interest rates cut. Then on the 12th of March, the first stimulus package. This was 17.6 billion, which in the context of Australian stimulus packages is very large. It was mainly around getting stimulus to those poorer groups so that they could bring money into the economy. It was rapidly received that that was not going to be enough to cope with the crisis that we were seeing. So a second stimulus package was offered of $66 billion on the 22nd of March. And then again on the 30th of March, we put another $130 billion into the stimulus packages. This was a particularly useful package in that it allowed businesses to keep employees on their books where the government would pay them, but because there was no market and there was no business for them to do, the business itself wouldn't have to pay them. In the face of the health response and the government response, we realised fairly quickly that this would be a serious situation, but even early on, we didn't understand how serious. So on the 18th of February, we gave our first industry briefing on the issue. From this date, we provided regular updates to the sector in face of the rapid evolving situation. Because we have states and territories in Australia, it means that there are different rules that apply across the country. So we felt that there was a need to provide a single trusted source of information. And this would allow businesses to be able to make informed business decisions. One other aspect that we do have in Australia is we have an industry crisis management plan. This is a plan that we have developed between government and industry to work out who provides communications and provides the source of information in the industry when a crisis hits. We first invoked this for the bushfire crisis, which no doubt many of you have seen across your television screens and across the social media in Europe that happened earlier this year. Under this crisis management plan, Australian Grape and Wine became the media spokesman and the first point of contact for government on any relief measures and indeed on any measures that were relevant to the industry. Vintage in 2020 became around normal timing, so it started in around January, but it was a smaller vintage due to prolonged drought, and it was also not as compressed as some other vintages in recent times have been. By Easter, COVID-19 restrictions were well in place, but we still had 30 to 40% of the crop due to be harvested. The issue for the wine sector was to make sure that we could still harvest and process this crop and go about our business, because we have one shot at it, being the grape and wine industry, once a year. And if we miss that window, we have no other source of income. With our non-essential services being closed down, our efforts were then placed on maintaining our right to stay open to complete the harvest. And I will say that cellar doors and on-premise venues were essentially closed from the 12th of March. Australia has around 2,700 wineries, 2,700. The majority of these are very small family-owned businesses who rely on cellar door and direct sales to either consumers and also to local restaurants. For many of these operations, their only source of revenue was closed from the 12th of March. To coordinate the activities between government and industry, which was critical in an effective response, our Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management was regularly meeting with agriculture industries by telephone. We're also in daily contact with both the Agriculture and Trade Minister to keep them up to date with the issues that were affecting our sector. By the 25th of March, we had received an assurance that were classed as essential as an agriculture industry. And this meant that the movement of labour, freight, and the supply of inputs for our sector would be maintained in the COVID-19 crisis. This is particularly critical because with states with different regulations and different border closures, we need to have the ability to pick grapes and those people to pick grapes to move across borders and to people to move grape marc and grape juice in trucks across borders. In order to maintain our essential industry status, we had to provide the tools to industry to demonstrate to government that they could operate in a manner that was both safe for their employees and that they were able to respond in the case of a COVID-19 outbreak. To do this, we notified these directly to the grape and wine sector. So we had direct links to all the grape and wine producers in Australia, and we also put this on our website. And these messages are available, and I would encourage you to look at them at the website that I have there below. So what we did was provide regular updates, and during the critical period of the crisis, these were daily updates as things changed so quickly. So as an example of the guidelines we provided for the grape and wine businesses. So we have COVID-19 health and safety guidelines for vineyard workers. You must remember we're in the middle of picking. We had risk management templates for businesses. Each business needed a template so that they could demonstrate to government that they were in a position to respond to a COVID-19 outbreak in their business. We had fact sheets that told everyone in the industry what they needed to do. One of the critical issues that we found was labour protocols. And the movement of labour became very, very important for us as there were restrictions on the numbers of people, the social distances they could have, and what you could do when you had groups of pickers moving between businesses.
Tony, 2 minutes left.
Okay. We also provided guidance on how to manage cases of coronavirus and also cleaning and disinfection guidelines. So the key planning elements would have risk management plans, cleaning protocols, hygiene and availability of sanitizer projects, and social distancing. It worked. We had a worker with COVID-19 at one of our largest wineries on the 3rd of April. Following a deep clean and isolation of the workers on that shift, the winery is back up and running on the 6th of April. This could only occur because of those traceability protocols, separation of workers into shifts, cleaning and hygiene protocols. Since vintage, we are now looking at pruning protocols and webinars for prunings, and we're also looking at protocols for the opening of cellar doors. The other things that we're working on are virtual tastings, virtual wine shows, virtual reality for promotion, and tourism programs. Critical in our success was the government-industry partnership, and particularly the government appointed a special envoy for agriculture with direct contact to us as a peak industry body. And we have been recognised for our vital role that we've played by providing a conduit of information out of the sector, but also to the government to provide key responses. So these are, and this is my second last slide, a lot of information was provided from many sources, so industry required a single trusted source. The state border closures meant we had to negotiate cross-border protocols to allow the movement of staff across and within borders. We did have problems. We needed effective labour hire standards to ensure the safety of workers. In conclusion, it became critical that there was one single authoritative voice from the industry to work with government. It has stood us in good stead, but we have now a lot of work to do as we were going to have a long recovery period. The Australian economy will take a long time to recover, as will the international economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And thanks also for your time stewardship. Next in this line of speakers is Jeffrey Clarke from New Zealand. Jeffrey, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you can see my screen and hear me now. Thanks very much, Antonio, and thanks to the OIV for calling this session. And a shout out to John Biker for suggesting it a few weeks ago. I think it's a great initiative for us to be holding. I think it's really interesting to hear the situation of Australia and to compare the similarities and differences of what we have experienced here in New Zealand. So I'm the General Manager of Advocacy of New Zealand Wine Growers. We are the industry body representing all of the grape growers and winemakers in New Zealand. And I think similar to Australia, really the situation here can be described as something of a perfect storm. The very first case of COVID-19 in New Zealand arrived at the end of February, right before the start of our harvest. The New Zealand government could see that around the world there was an alarming and very rapid rise in cases because other cases had got their first cases, other countries had got their first cases well before us. So their response was characterized as stop the spread, go early and go hard. And I'm very pleased to say that that result has worked. Today, the New Zealand Ministry of Health announced that we now have only one active case left. There have been no cases of COVID-19 in the past week, and the country got up to just over 1,500 cases in total. Throughout the government's response to COVID-19 in New Zealand, it's been a principled approach. They follow that stop the spread, go early, go hard. They closed the borders within 3 weeks of that first case arriving. There was a full lockdown in place, and we had an alert level system. So in much of our communications and all of the country's communications, we have been referring to the 4 different alert levels of the differing graduated restrictions applying to our economy. Of course, this lockdown of the entire economy happened at the very first week of harvest in Blenheim, which represents 76% of our nation's crop. So it was an absolutely critical time for us. The key principles that they followed were that the entire country during lockdown had to stay in their bubble, and that essential businesses were permitted to open, but only if those businesses could assure the government that there would be no transmission of disease if a worker in their work environment had the disease. So only essential businesses could open, but only if they could also provide assurances that there would be no transmission. We lobbied hard and got the comfort that we needed that vineyards and wineries were classified as essential because they were part of the food chain. The regime that was adopted was not unfamiliar to New Zealand businesses. Under our health and safety at work framework, business owners are personally responsible for ensuring the health and safety of workers within their workplace. And a similar approach was taken here. Each business owner was only able to keep their business open and operating as an essential business if they could provide the assurances that their workers would be safe. So the regulatory response in New Zealand, because of the timing, it was very much built on the fly. The images of an aircraft being built while in flight. The lockdown came for our industry right as we were we were like the busiest part of our harvest. So it was urgent and immediate, and there really was no time to consult or to check the processes that the government was putting in place, but it was health and data and science driven. That meant that the government was able to give us the principles that we needed to follow and rely on us as the industry association to implement those. That meant that there was close collaboration between the senior levels of our Ministry for Primary Industries and the Health Department and the leadership of our industry. It was close communication with frequent Zoom meetings to keep in touch. And as I said, the onus was on the industry to guide and self-regulate. We were given latitude to take the principles that the government was giving us and then to interpret those and make decisions for our members as to how our members needed to apply them, and to provide guidance to our members and to share that same guidance with the government. So both the government and our members knew what we were requiring. The industry was given that latitude, but we had to be confident that it would not result in the spread of the disease, because we were also assured by the government that if there was any spread of disease, our businesses would close. And as Tony said, we have a once-a-year opportunity. This was it. We knew that we couldn't blow it. So that put a huge obligation on us as the industry body. Like in Australia, we had to move very rapidly to produce guidance. We set up a new website, a 24/7 help desk number. We held webinars for the entire membership. And we found that it was very effective to us to rapidly get initial guidance out. So whenever there was a clarification or a new decision came from the government as to what was required or expected, we would produce guidance, send it out to all of our members through our website, advise them that it was available. And you won't be able to see the details on that patch on the screen there, which is some of the documents. But I think our guidance for operating as an essential business at level 4 was about 30 pages long and up to version 10 before we moved down to level 3. That website link there, similar to Australia, all of our materials we've made publicly available, so anyone that wants to have a look at the materials we produce for our members, it's all there to be seen. In terms of what the key impacts on our harvest were, obviously all movement of people around the country stopped. Everyone was legally required to stay in their home, in their bubble, unless they were working, but they weren't allowed to move between regions or move anywhere other than to their place of work and back home again. In practice, the key limitations on harvest and wine production were governed by the 2-meter distancing rule. No person in the workplace was allowed to be less than 2 meters away from any other person within the workplace. There were also personal protective equipment requirements, and obviously that entailed massive changes to the way our vineyard and winery operations worked. It made hand harvesting very difficult. It made the availability of labor, not being able to move people between cities, towns, and regions challenging. It made work accommodation very challenging because we had to ensure that workers who were in clusters didn't move from one place to another. It made the practical operations within a winery to observe those 2-meter distancing rules very challenging in some places. And it meant that harvest decisions became more difficult. Was the vineyard going to harvest the grapes early for certainty, or were they going to leave them on the vines for a little bit longer to get the quality they are looking for, but run the risk that there might be a case and they'd have to close their entire vineyard and not harvest the fruit? So as a result, like in Australia, we produced detailed protocols on distancing, on cleaning, tracing, infection, anything we thought our members might need. We aimed to have a protocol, a guide ready. And of course, we worked with them to develop those because a lot of them developed them very quickly themselves. We took the best of them and shared them back out to members. One of the approaches that our government has taken, we have a population of 5 million people in New Zealand. They tried very hard to get the entire population to understand that we were all in this together as a team. They call us the team of 5 million. And I think within the wine industry, we're the team of 1,500 wine businesses. We all felt we were working together, and there was a lot of collaborative sharing of information. There was a lot of resilience planning that had to go on as along with those protocols. Many of our wineries in particular divided their staff in the vineyard and in the winery into A teams, B teams, and C teams, or color-coded teams. They had color-coded high-vis vests on or armbands, and the teams of different colors had to stay completely isolated in different parts from each other, so that if one of those teams had an infection, they would automatically know which team was out and had to be replaced by another team. In the end, we never had to rely on that, but those resilience measures were there in case they were needed. The government was auditing our compliance with these requirements. So part of everything we had to do was detailed record keeping. Everything had to be planned and recorded, but of course it had to be done in a safe way as well. So it all had to be done digitally, so there was no paper being shuffled around. Another important aspect that we found was maintaining social license. Because only essential businesses were allowed to open in New Zealand, there was some initial criticism, or why should the wine industry be considered an essential business when some other businesses aren't essential? We took a proactive approach to that. We very publicly set up a safe harvest reporting line and encouraged anyone who saw any practice in a vineyard or winery that they weren't comfortable or safe to report that to us. And that was very effective in regaining our social license to operate. So I think in terms of our overall assessment of how completing a harvest under COVID-19 conditions went, I would say it's possible. We've achieved it, but it was a real challenge to complete the grape harvest and all the winemaking while ensuring there was no possible transmission under those strict conditions. I think it will be very difficult, sorry, it will be very different for a Northern Hemisphere harvest. You will have the advantage of having time to prepare, whereas we literally had no time to prepare. And I'm sure you'll find you'll be at a different stage of the disease evolution in your country. So your challenges, I'm sure, will be quite different from ours. In terms of what it meant for our harvest, there was a reduction in volume. Everything took longer. We estimate there's something in the order of around 5% lower harvest than there might otherwise been. Very hard to tell at this stage. There was obviously a material increase in the cost because all of these measures that were put in place significantly increased the cost, and a lot of stress for all of the workers involved.
Jeffrey, 1 minute.
Ultimately, success was achieved in our harvest because the government trusted our industry body and trusted that our industry was doing what was required, and we rose to the challenge as the trusted body to deliver that. Similarly, as Tony has noted, the next level of challenge comes to getting through winter pruning, getting the right workers in place in order to produce the harvest for next year. And I'll just close with a nice chart that shows New Zealand having now got down to 0 active case, or 1 active case, and hoping to go to 0 in the next few days. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Really interesting, these first 2 presentations from Australia and New Zealand. I have many questions in my mind, but we will reserve those for the debates that will follow these 5 presentations from our invited experts. So now we move, if I'm not mistaken, 8 time zones away. And I would like to call onto the floor our South African representative, Yvette van der Merwe. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the OIV for organising the webinar. I must say I'm going to present quite a different view on COVID than what my colleagues in Australia and New Zealand have just presented, and you'll see why. A lot of challenges that we have that's quite different to some of the other countries. So you'll see my title says management, because it's not just harvest. We had a lot of other challenges to deal with regards to COVID. So the COVID situation, or the virus, came to South Africa a little bit later than in Australia and New Zealand. So we were fairly lucky in the sense that in March we had a light version in terms of measures implemented. So by the time on the 23rd of March, when we were told we were going in full lockdown, there was only about 5% of the total harvest that still had to be dealt with. And the initial indications were that the wine industry was to be classified as essential. So we were all very happy and content that we would be able, with protocols and health and safety measurements, that we will be able to see the harvest through. And then the next minute, we got hit by the publication of the regulations of the Disaster Management Act, that only food products were listed as essential, and we as an industry, or the total alcohol industry, was told that there would be no sales of any alcohol in the South African market within that 3 weeks of full lockdown. So we were at level 5, so for that 21 days we were in level 5. So we initially were told 21 days, and then after the 21 days we were given another 2 weeks in level 4. And yeah, so the lockdown has been coming along for quite some time in South Africa. So there was a bit of a scurry, not a bit of a scurry, a huge scurry in the industry, because we, as I said, we were not allowed to finish with our activities. And the industry made an urgent application to government to allow for certain dispensations. And we asked for harvesting activities to be completed, and also to secure the stock and prevent wastage in all of this, because as you know, when you stop harvesting, that's only one aspect. There are various other aspects within the cellar that had to be dealt with as well. And then we also asked for the export of wine. So we did understand the local lockdown and no sales of any alcohol on the local market, but we asked for the exports of wine to continue. Then on the 26th of March, via the government gazette, you can see what was added. So we were allowed to continue with harvesting and storage activities with regards to the primary agricultural goods. And we had to interpret that for the industry. And you can see that we then said that we can continue with the harvesting activities. What we did right at the start of the full lockdown is we also created a public website where all of the information was dealt with to industry. And I think we're already on something like a newsletter 25. So a lot of interpretation of government regulations and keeping industry informed of all that happened. So, and you can see at the bottom, so we as an industry sat with the dilemma in terms of no exports, no local sales. So it was literally at that stage a fight for survival. So there were task teams brought together. So the first task team had to deal with the export situation. So a lot of submissions were made to government. We spoke to government. We told them that they must please allow exports, that the transmission of the virus was a low risk. We set up protocols for loading and all the actions to do with exports. And we presented all of that information to government to give them the assurance that to open up the export market won't pose that huge risk to the transmission of the virus. So then, yeah, as you can see, those actions I already spoke to. So then on the 7th of April, the industry were told that we could transport and export. We were extremely excited. And then literally a week later, we were told that, or the government gazette regulation came out to say that we may not transport wine. So they did not block the exports of wine. They just told us that we may not transport. So that's quite impossible. I mean, we have to get the wine to the ports. So that immediately stopped us in our tracks and put us back to square one in terms of our activities. So a lot has been done since that is, we again had a lot of submissions, made a lot of submissions to government. We showed them the impact of what such a situation will do to industry. And then luckily from the 1st of May, we again could transport and export our wines. During the whole course of May, we made submissions, not only as a wine industry, but as part of the total alcohol industry. So our colleagues within the spirit industry, the beer industry, all came together, and joint submissions were made to government to address the local situation. And I'll speak to some of the challenges that we have just now. And at last, we got the good news yesterday that the local market will open up. We are moving to level 3 on the 1st of June. And that within level 3, we will be allowed a limited sales of alcohol to off-trade. We still have no on-consumption sales. The off-trade will be in limited trading hours and days. Online sales are allowed, but delivery must adhere to the specified time frame. And then we have quite a substantial number of premises that have on-consumption licenses, and seeing as on-consumption won't be allowed, those licenses will be converted to off-consumption licenses. So those on-consumption premises will be allowed to trade for off-consumption purposes. And then, which is a thread through all of our communications, our submissions, engagement with government, is to assure them that the relevant health protocols and social distancing measures is in place and will be adhered to at all times. So this is one of the submissions that was made to government to talk to the safe opening of the trade in level 3. And we from an industry side had to show to show government our intent and what we were prepared to do to get the industry to work safely. And this are perhaps just some of the information that I want to show you. In South Africa, we have substantial socioeconomic issues to deal with. And we do think that that was part of the reason why local sales were not allowed. So in our submission to government, we addressed a lot of these issues. So we addressed gender-based violence, we addressed drink driving, and then of course we also had to look at social distancing given the spread of the COVID-19 virus. We had to address illicit trade, and then we showed the economic impact to government in terms of what has already happened with the lockdown, but what will happen if we continue with no sales within this lockdown. So this is a lot of information, and I don't want you to go into the details, but this literally what we presented to government to tell them what will happen to the sales, what will happen to indirect taxes, what will happen to the trade balance, what will happen to jobs. And we presented all of this information to government to show them what will be the impact of a continued ban on local sales. We also asked via questionnaire to industry, what do they see within all of this? And we asked them, one of the questions that we asked them was, what are they concerned about? And I mean, you can go through all of that details. It is literally, again, back to fighting for survival. Then this is a part of the impact. So we literally showed them what will be the impact. And you can see there that we spoke about 800 micro and SME liquor manufacturers that will face bankruptcy. Large companies that will not be able to pay their wage bills. A lot of stimulation packages was made available to the whole of the economy, but we also showed them that there are a large number of firms representing about 77% of local sales that won't have access to the loan guarantee funds. So that posed a huge problem for the financial sustainability of the whole of the alcohol industry, of which the wine is part and parcel of.
Yvette, 2 minutes.
I think I'm almost done, and this is just perhaps something that I wanted to summarize. As I said, we did not have too many issues eventually with the harvest environment. The South African economy or the nation is going into a phase where we are still seeing the COVID cases increasing. In the Western Cape, where the wine industry is mainly situated, the indications are that we will peak in July only. So we are unfortunately not yet through.
I think we have lost Yvette for a moment. Are you still there, Yvette? Oh, okay. I don't think she is. Okay, so I think we move on to the next speaker. And I guess Yvette was concluding, making her concluding remarks. So keeping on this travel across space and time, we started at 9 p.m. in Australia, later in New Zealand, I guess. We were at 12 p.m. in South Africa, and now we move on to the morning in South America. So our next speaker will be Aurelio Montes from Chile. Aurelio, please, the floor is yours. You just have to unmute. Okay, yeah. That's good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Aurelio.
Okay, yes, I still have the on the screen, you know, the South African presentation. Is still there. I don't know.
Yes, we will try with the Secretariat in Paris to see if we can remove that. But I believe you do not have a presentation, right, yourself?
No, that's correct. So it doesn't matter much. I don't have a presentation. I would just talk, you know, in relation to our harvest here in Chile and how did it happen.
Okay.
First of all, hello to everyone. I hope that everyone, families and loved ones are sane and safe. First of all, that's very important. We have to be careful of all of that. Going into our harvest, the red light was lit up in January when we heard about, you know, the COVID-19 that was hitting China and increasingly growing there. So we put an eye, but we didn't have much of a concern. We didn't know how hard it would come into Chile. So the first real notice of an infection here in Chile, it happened the last week of February. Let me put the big screen there. Yeah, the last week of February, close, you know, to March, when we were starting picking our white wines, our white grapes. Things were fast, as you can imagine, and you all know, we're suffering a big drought here in Chile. So the ripeness of the grapes were coming early. We were facing a small crop. So we were already picking the whites, which is a little bit early in February. And of course, during March, we speeded up a little bit when we heard about, you know, this pandemic. The reaction at the beginning was slow because the thread was there, but we didn't have really, you know, a real vision of how things would come on time. So by the last week of March, we started to speed up with the concern the authority could stop the process by avoiding the mobilization of people towards vineyards and wineries. By the time, you know, the authority, the government was already closing borders. So you could, if you came into Chile, you have to go through a quarantine, so people stopped coming here. No airlines stopped flying in and out, and some specific locations in the country that were starting to be heavily affected were isolated and stopped in some way. So there, you know, the big concern of the wine industry started to grow. The harvest was happening with not much of a problem. You know, people were going to work. We didn't have problems to move around. But as we had the fear that the authority could react and could put some sort of problems to move around the country, that meant that workers couldn't reach the vineyards, or the people couldn't go to the cellars. You know, our association, Wines of Chile, started to press, you know, the government, and we had, you know, lots of meetings with the authorities, the Minister of Agriculture, to explain how difficult could be for the industry if there was a problem to keep on working smoothly, you know, and gently. We have more than 13,000 small producers here that live. They depend on the vineyards, and they depend on the business. We have more than 300 wineries, you know, exporting mainly wines and selling locally here. And Wines of Chile, the association that I represent, we count for the 80% of the production and exports of the country. So there are very few liters or kilograms of grapes that are not associated to our association. So the authorities were very positive to us, and they realized that it would be a big problem, a social problem, if they put too much of a problematic in terms of mobilization of people. So we kept on working with our people, moving to the vineyards and to the cellars with not much of a problem. But of course, we started taking some measures to keep our people safe. We wanted to have our workers, their families, you know, totally safe. So of course, we started with all the things that all of you also know, the proper distances among the people, the social distance. We provided masks to people. We provided gloves, you know, hand washing was a must several times a day. So we transport our people, our workers to the fields and to the wineries, you know, in the proper way to keep them safe and to be able to finish our harvest. So at the end, I would say that our story in Chile is more a happy story. We could finish our harvest. We could wait the proper timing of the ripening of the ripening of the grapes to be able to produce the quality we're willing to produce. And the workers actually, and I would like to use this moment to congratulate and to thank our people, because they kept on working with a lot of responsibility and passion at the level of the fields. They never missed, you know, a day working. They realized how important it was to keep on working and have our grapes in the winery and safe for the coming harvest. In terms of recommendations, of course, as I just explained, we increase the shifts at the level of the cellar more than at the level of the vineyard. In the vineyard, we had to run fast. So at the level of the cellar, we had two different shifts, you know, A and B, where we had half of the people working, you know, at the process of crushing, fermenting, bottling, and everything. But at the level of the vineyard, we had full payroll working the whole day. Our harvest, as I was mentioning, could be finished with not much of a problem, but we had to deal with the permits to move our people to the cellar. We finished our harvest very early this year. It was by the third week of April. So by that time, you know, the contamination in Chile was very low. We're just beginning to have, you know, the first cases of or more intense cases of infection and some lethality that was a pity. So we could do the work at the level of the vineyard was not a problem, but the cellar started to face some trouble in moving people. And so we had to get some permits of the local authority that were giving to each winery differently, you know, to allow the people to move in certain hours. They couldn't move other than home to work. They were not allowed to move to any other place, visiting people or going to shop to the small towns around our vineyards. So although there were some problems, you know, to move around, the authorities were good enough to allow us to keep up to now, you know, not a problem. Now, more than the harvest and the crushing season and the fermentation process that was pretty good and low in volume, we diminished to 20% of total sales. The problem comes, you know, more in the commercial side, that although we are free to move around with our wines, we don't have any prohibition to either drink alcohol or to move around. Of course, the on-trade, all the restaurants, bars, hotels are closed, but you can still consume alcohol at home with your family, basically, privately. So the big problem that we had to face, you know, is the on-trade. The on-trade that counts more or less for 25% of our total sales, both in the export market and locally, you know, it's flat down to zero. The same that is happening to all of the rest of the people, you know, the off-trade, the off licenses, and the online sales, you know, grew quite a bit, especially the online, and that, you know, helped a little bit, not totally, but helped a little bit, you know, the low sales that we're facing on the on-trade. So today we're
2 minutes.
Okay, so today we're facing more a problem of a commercial problem than the technical problem of having processed the grapes and finishing totally our harvest. So we're glad to see that in Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere, you know, the normality, it's coming little by little. Now Spain, Italy are starting to open. China, that is an important market for Chile, it's more open than any other country today. So the exports, that it's about 70% of our production here in Chile, started to move again, you know, slowly to normality. So we're very happy to learn this, and of course we will see very closely what the Northern Hemisphere is, how the Northern Hemisphere is reacting to keep our industry safe. And that would be it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aurelio. Very interesting experience, different experience as well. So we are having a very educative panorama of what happened across these countries. And now we move to a neighbor country of Chile, to Argentina. It will be our last speaker in this session, Daniel Rada from Argentina. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi to everyone. Well, I hope that sharing our experience can help Northern Hemisphere wine industry. Go to Argentina. Here in this first chart, we have a period of time that starts in February and ends in the middle of May. This is the time that the harvest took in our this year harvest. And the first issue to point out is that the first case was detected in Argentina in March the 3rd. A couple of days before that, after that, excuse me, the World Health Organization stated the world situation as a pandemic. Unfortunately, about a month before that, the industry started a sequence of meetings thinking about how to face the pandemic. And you have two options. One is isolation, and the other, of course, is activity under a protocol. So at the same time, a technical team started to work and develop a protocol that was ready during the second week of March. So as soon as the industry was noticed that the national government is very close to take some measures, we immediately asked through the local governments to be excluded from these activities that are going to be under quarantine. And the result was that on March 19, when the national government issued the decree stating the quarantine situation, the industry was excluded as an essential activity, so the harvest can continue. The sector immediately sent the protocol to all the actors of the chains, and as I said, the harvest can continue normally. We are at this moment in a range of the harvest about 51 to 68%, in the order of 60% of the harvest, with 1 billion kilos left and about 60 days ahead to finish the harvest. And the result was that we didn't have any delay in the process of harvest. The quantity of harvest was the one we expected. And the most important thing was that no cases were detected in all this period. So our first recommendation is anticipation and be ready. Be ready for the moment when you need a quick response, as well as a quick react when some measure is taken. What does the protocol contain? Well, for sure, the most important thing was workers, and the protocol was focused on this, and of course, to keep workers safe. Some of the most important items included in the protocol are these, and of course, all of them have an impact in revenues or in expenses. Wineries were close to visitors, with the corresponding impact in the revenues because of tourism and the sales that come from direct to consumers. Restrictions on quantity of people working in the same place, that implies an increase in the number of shifts in order to decrease the quantity of persons, of people working in the same place at the same time. Some other restrictions about hygiene over workers and the use of tools and equipment, and of course that implies an increase in some expenses, not only in the operative one, but in some capital investment, in some capital goods. Transport restriction, it is perhaps the most important problem that we face during the harvest, because in Argentina, usually workers are transported in one vehicle in groups of 10 to 12 persons, and the protocol requires that no more than 3 persons can be transported in one vehicle. Something similar happens when the grape is transferred from the vineyards to the wineries, so an important coordination is needed in the entry and exit of the trucks into into the wetlands. Another groups of rules were taken into account. These sustainable and good practices are rules that exist before the protocol was created. But despite of this fact, these rules were included, and not just this, but they were the protocol emphasizing the compliance on these pre-existing rules. The result that we have applying this protocol, as I said before, is that 0 cases were detected during the harvest, and furthermore, we haven't detected any case up to now. And I am talking about all the industry, all the sectors, and all the regions of production. So the second recommendation is a strict compliance of protocols in order to keep workers safe. How was the process carried out? Well, it's important to remark that during 2004, a forum of discussion was created by the industry. The result of this forum was a strategic plan, the wine strategic plan of Argentina, that is executed by the corporation, the Wine Corporation of Argentina. And there we have present both public and private sector, with in one hand, or the private sector with grape producers, wine producers, wineries, and on the other, the public sector with the Mendoza and San Juan government. These two provinces produce about 90% of the total production of the country, and two institutes that belongs to the national government. So this structure implies a very strong institutional organization, and that was useful in this process of making the protocol. But of course, all other actors were invited to participate, like university, of course, medical professionals and health professionals, worker unions, information providers, and technical teams. And this, as I say, important network, institutional network, finally issued a protocol that was sent to all the sector grape producers, wine producers, and wineries.
Daniel, 2 minutes left.
Okay. So the third recommendation is a strong institutional coordination, and the last one means to carry out the process. Of course, digital tools is being one of the most important tools during this day. A lot of activities are around it, and well, we can say that any new technology was developed during this period, but for sure we observe an increase in the rate of use of the high-level technology. Another thing that we are doing all the time is to provide information to all the actors, information about production, about markets, about how foreign and domestic markets are evolving, and to result that this forum that I mentioned have another important result that we are now one of the activities that are benefits with health, the financial help that the national government intended to help, in this case, wineries to afford labor costs, of course, to maintain the level employment, and finally, to end, another thing that we think is very important is training and instruction to workers, and it had two different effects. In one hand, an increase in the self-care of the workers, and on the other, a very important improvement in the efficiency in the operation of their task. Well, that's all. Thank you. And of course, good luck for the Northern Hemisphere.
Very well. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, all 5 speakers. I think we have had a very comprehensive, interesting, and differently proposed approaches to the management of this crisis. I think it was quite interesting to see how across the different geographies our speakers are coming from. We have had a set of measures put in place according to the local conditions and country, and to the specificities of each country, and also to the more early or later moment that the pandemic hit each of the countries. I am now moving on to a debate with all 5 of you. I take the moment also to inform our participants that are watching us that they have the possibility of making questions to us during the debate by using the question and answer feature of Zoom. We won't be able to answer all questions, but we have a very competent team in the Secretariat of Paris trying to sum up the most important and the most referred questions, and they will be supplied to me. To set things going, I would like to ask from every of you 5 speakers, after that you have given us this perspective of what happened, how you coped, what worked, what didn't work. I would ask each of you to single out what has been the most important thing for you with this experience. And to make it more challenging, I would ask you to do that as if it was a tweet, that is in 140 characters or less. So just a sentence from each of you. How did this experience most struck you now that you are looking back onto it? Tony, would you like to start?
In 140 characters?
Or less.
The governments didn't know the answer, so they looked to the industry to provide the solutions. That was the big take home for us.
Okay, Jeffrey?
I would say move quickly and be prepared to change your advice quickly.
Very nice. Yvette?
Work on good relationships with government.
Okay. Aurelio, what would be your take on this? What did you learn?
I am very impressed about the strength and quality of the industry to react and to face the authorities to keep on moving. I think that we are strong, we are capable of moving forward, we're innovative.
Okay, so resilience, right. And Daniel?
Well, as I said, I think anticipation, be ready, and a strong institutional network. I think that public-private networks are really very effective.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I think it was a common point of most of your presentations. Pretty much all of you focused the needs and the importance that you had when having a good coordination between industry and government in dealing with the situation. Another important point that struck me was communication. It seemed to be really important, the role of defining at a very early stage who would communicate and how that institution would reach the maximum number possible of targets when communicating, in order also to pass as fast as possible and with the least confusion possible the needed communication to the people on the ground. And I think that one of the things that struck me most across your presentations, in many instances, we could see that the implementation of good communication from an early moment actually made it successful from one side, keeping your businesses open and being able to conclude the harvest. And as a second part, also in ensuring what is the most important is that people are protected and are kept safe so that you can carry on. So now I would move on to another question, this time a little bit more characters than just 140. So the question would be, if you would single out a practical action that actually made the difference on you coming where you are now, what would that be? I have made a number of notes here when you were talking. I highlighted well, I already spoke about that, communication, but also anticipation. Danielle has just mentioned that. The coordination between all players, and here not just the coordination between government and industry, but also coordination between the industry itself and also with other public institutions. Danielle mentioned that as well. Yvette was quite focusing the crisis management mode they went towards, but also and this was also a common factor across your presentations, the responsibility, the self-accountability that the industries took in dealing with this issue. So these were my takes, but I would like to hear you on that and understand if you could single out a specific practical action that actually could make the difference in a situation like this. Yvette, would you like to start?
Yes, perhaps I would. We have a lot of discussions within the industry because we're very fragmented. We've got a lot of institutions and a lot of units working on different aspects within the industry. And for quite some time, we have had discussions in terms of how we can work better together and how we can cut out duplication and how we need to present a unified front when engaging with government and all other interested parties that engage with the wine industry. And I think that the one thing that we were taught through all of this crisis was that we can actually work well together. When the crisis struck, it was just unbelievable to see every single body within the wine industry, whether you were a wine seller or a buyer or a wholesaler or a supplier to the industry, everybody just stood together, and we realized that we had to work together on a submission to government. So in spite of all the different views and perspectives and profit objectives, it was just amazing to see how we can actually, given different perspectives, we could work very well together. And it was just amazing to see that we literally, you could in one day present or compile this wonderful 30-page submission or 6-page submission where everybody was in agreement with. So we were able to act swiftly, we were able to work well together in spite of having differences in opinion. So that to me was just amazing.
Thank you, Yvette. Really interesting. I'd like to see your perspective on this, Jeffrey, because it struck to me that you kind of like had planned for this in well before. So was a pandemic a possibility already planned for in the past in New Zealand?
No, I don't think a pandemic was squarely in our planning, but we do have reasonable risk management processes. So we were prepared for unexpected things, and part of that involved having a good crisis management plan in place. So we have faced crises of different sorts, such as earthquakes before, and we were used to responding to those. So quite early on in the piece, we said, this is the same. We need to treat this as a crisis. We put in place a crisis management team and protocols. And going back to your original question, Antonio, I would say the one thing that really made a difference for us was transparency. In a crisis, it's crisis management 101, but you need to be transparent about what you know and what you don't know. And I think that built trust both with our members who were looking to us for guidance and with the government. We were able to say to our members, we don't know the answer to that question, but we'll find out. And I think that gave us a lot more credibility, both with our members and with the government in managing.
Sure, that's really relevant and quite sensible, of course. Tony, what about you in Australia? Did you also acted quite early? Was this a possibility that had been ever thought about? And also, what would be your number one practical advice?
Yeah, so we didn't expect a pandemic, but as you may have recalled, we had an enormous bushfire crisis this year. So we, like Jeffrey, were well used to crises, and we'd invoked our management plan and we did it again. I think the thing that came out of this was the trust that developed between government and industry. We've always had a good relationship, but in this case, they were forced to rely on us because they didn't have the resources to do it themselves, and they understood that we had the expertise in our area, and it went both ways. So it developed a whole lot of trust, and that meant that our response was so much more effective. It also brought our industry together to realise that they needed someone there to guide them, or else they would not be able to operate. And if it wasn't for the fact we had risk management plans and developed and gave them to industry to develop for their businesses, we would have been closed. And I think it's been a very powerful lesson for the industry that you need to be aware and responsible, and for the government that they need industry, and a partnership works, and aggressive behaviour towards each other doesn't work. Okay. I also saw in one of the questions that were answered on the Q&A here that you have a lot of your acreage under mechanical harvest, which must have made also an important difference in the way you manage this situation. I would like also to understand in the other countries, Yvette, Daniel, and Aurelio, what is the estimated percentage of mechanical versus manual harvesting that you have? Daniel, would you start?
Well, in our case, it's really a very small part. Mechanics harvest is really low. It must about in the order of 10 to 50%, no more than 15%, no more than this.
Okay, so I've seen that in New Zealand we have about 30% manual, 10% manual, and in Australia 10%. In Australia 30% manual. That's it. So we have a totally different situation. What about you, Yvette, in South Africa? What would be the breakdown between manual and mechanical?
I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figures, but it is
just an estimate.
Quite. I think it must be somewhere between 20 and 40%. I'm not too sure.
You mean manual?
No, mechanical. Sorry.
Mechanical. Okay.
Mechanical. Yes. Sorry.
Okay. And Aurelio in Chile?
Yeah. Well, the Chilean case is that the mechanical, harvest has been growing dramatically year through year. It started very slow. Today, I would say that it should be something close to 30 or even 40%. It's mechanical, and the rest is manual.
Okay. Okay, and continuing our discussion, I think this is important to put in context the different measures and the most important things. I mean, it's different if you have 10% manual harvest or 10% mechanical harvest in the way you deal with a situation where protecting people is an important issue. But Aurelio, in Chile, from you, what was the most important thing that you think made the difference to come where you are right now with the harvest closed?
Well, I think that the key issue for every country is to be associated. We have a very strong association here in Chile, as I told you. Well, the members of our association count for 80% of our production and exports and local sales. So when you have such a big block, it makes it easier to face, you know, the problem, to take measures, and most of all, to face the authorities. I would say that one of the most important factors that helped, you know, to our vintage to be as I said, a happy story at the end, was how close we were to the local authorities, starting from the Minister of Agriculture downwards, and be able to explain very clearly how important for employment, commerce, and even, you know, the image of the country. In the case of Chile, we export 70% of our production, and that means that you have millions and millions of people facing a bottle of wine with the label of Chile, its varieties, its valleys, and everything that it's, you know, in a label. So being close to the authorities and being a strong association was key to make things happen very, very fast, and we could face the harvest with nearly no problem.
Okay, Daniel, in Argentina, what would have it been?
Well, again, and I agree with Aurelio, I think that coordination and all the sector in the same target is very important. Well, and I think that it's very close to what I said in my presentation, that if you have a good coordination, not only with public entities, but in it, the industry, it's very important to go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I have here a question which I think has already been mostly answered by all of you. The question was, how important is the role of industry and interprofessional organizations during the COVID-19 crisis? I think this was well evident from everything you have exposed so far. So I would move on to an opposite question to the last one, which is, what would you have done differently if you were to be now with the advantage of hindsight in the beginning of such a situation that, God forbid, would happen again? And this is an open question for the floor. So whoever wants to start, please do.
Different.
Yeah. Something that you learned that you would have, that you would do otherwise. No takers? Go, Tony.
I don't know what to have done differently. I'll tell you what we failed at. And what we failed at in Australia was convincing the government of the special characters of the grape and wine sector that meant that their economic stimulus packages wouldn't work for us. So we've left ourselves in a position where we have probably 30% of our wineries are under threat. They have still, the next 6 months are vital for their survival, as on-premise and cellar door and tourism will not recover quickly. And I'm not sure their cash flow will keep them alive. So I don't know how I would do it differently. We could not convince the government of the fact that we were in a different situation to where their stimulus packages would work. So I guess that's the thing I would have liked to have done better. And I managed to convince most of our ministers, but not the Prime Minister. And that's where the issue stops. So someone could do it, great.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Yvette, would you like to contribute?
Yes, perhaps and it's much to what Tony has just said. What we have realized is that we will seriously have to work with regards to our relationship with government. And I mean, we do have a government stakeholder, but I think there are various issues given our socioeconomic situation in South Africa that we as an alcohol industry, as a wine industry, have not addressed successfully. And we will have to work with government to address these issues. For example, we've started to work on a communication strategy as well. So we have a lot of work to do as an industry after this crisis has left us.
Okay, thank you. Aurelio, would you like to share with us something that you wish you would have done better if you could have?
Well, Anthony, as I explained, I think that we do have a very close relationship with our local authorities, you know, and we got amazing results, you know, due to this closeness that we have with them. What I would maybe try to push a little bit more in our local industry is technology, to be able to go a little bit faster. When you have a crisis, we have had many earthquakes and floods and problems, and normally, you know, what happens is that we need to push, you know, the speed of things and the technology at the level of the winery to be able to cope with bigger volumes of grapes in a short period of time, so we can have a safe harvest before the crisis, you know, gets to a level in which you can manage.
Okay, so would you think, and this is a question for you and for everybody else as well, would you think that it would be a good approach, for instance, for the OIV to start working with governments in planning for crises, in helping the different member states anticipate and plan to how to best react to this type of unique situations, but that when they hit hard?
I personally think that it's a key issue. You know, the OIV is very, very well respected around the world. Everyone knows, you know, the weight and the size, you know, how important to the industry it is. So the OIV, I have no doubt, that has an open door to all the governments around the world that produces wines. And that will be very helpful to make the governments be close to the local, you know, industry, and to the OIV as the international, you know, big partner of this huge industry.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment that?
I think if there's probably one aspect there that's relevant, it's the importance of government and industry working closely together to recognize that it can only be solved if it's considered a shared problem and a shared issue to deal with, because it has to be delivered on a very, very granular basis in every single business by every single person within that business. So it can't be imposed. It has to be a solution developed together.
So you mean not top-down, but a combination of bottom-up and top-down. So what would be the role of interprofessional organizations, wine interprofessional organizations in that process?
I mean, I think this kind of information sharing and learning from each other's experience is a great place to start.
Okay, very good. So moving on, next question for the floor is, what is it that was changed during this crisis, this COVID-19 crisis, that you believe is here to stay? What were the implemented measures that you weren't using before, but now that you have used them, you believe will remain, because in the end of the day, they represent a beneficial approach to what you used to do before? Anybody?
I mean, clearly, sorry. Clearly online. I mean, clearly, you know, the acceleration to digitalisation and online is just dramatically increased, and that will not go back to where it was before. So, I mean, that's the new world, and, you know, we can all see it now. When we're all in lockdown and, you know, we're still in various degrees of lockdown, that is going to continue to be the main drain. And so unless you can be nimble enough to get into that sphere, you will not exist. I think there's going to be many lessons. We like everyone, I think we are going through strategy sessions now, trying to look at the lessons and trying to understand what the future will bring. It's not clear, but we do know we will not go back to where we are now. And that if anyone thinks that the old business models will still work, then I think that they will not survive. And we understand we'll have a much smaller industry. We believe this will restructure our industry. If you're marginal, I think it will drive people out who were there for a lot of the lifestylers. We think will no longer stay present within our sector. So I can't tell the answer, but digitalisation. If you're not there, if that's not your main game, then you won't survive.
Do you agree with that, Daniel? In Argentina also is the crisis given a boost to digitalization? I believe you mentioned that all documents were going digital in there. So will it remain?
Well, we are used to crisis here in Argentina. And I think that's always a crisis implies at the same time an opportunity, and I am sure that we are going to find new tools, new methods, new channels. We don't know exactly what is going to happen, but I trust a lot in what you say about working together, thinking together, because for sure more people thinking in one problem is the best way that we can follow.
Okay, thank you very much. So I believe we are drawing to a conclusion of this webinar. I think it was really, really interesting and actually important to hear what all of you had to say. I'm pretty sure our audience gained a lot of insights from what you said. I would conclude summarizing what has been said here, that the main take-home messages are that resilience planning is key, so that if you in some way use the lessons that you have learned from past crises to prepare future crises, you become better prepared to manage them and you are far better off. So one important part of that has been underlined by Jeffrey is the transparency of all processes. Not just during the crisis, which of course, as you said, Jeffrey, it goes without saying. I mean, when you are managing a crisis, if you are not being transparent, you are not managing any crisis at all. So that is key, but also transparency for the planning for any future crisis. That gives, I believe, a sense of confidence to all the actors, to all the stakeholders in the value chain. Also, coupling that with sound planning for crisis management, and as Yvette has underlined, the coordination of all actors is an important issue here, and something that can mean the success or the failure of any effort towards addressing these issues. And finally, as Tony has just put in evidence, the digitalization, the fact that we had a lot of these tools already available before, but we were not nudged enough to start using them. And now that we have, because of the crisis, or more like it now that you have because of the crisis, they will remain. I think this is a very important take home for the Northern Hemisphere in the fact that sometimes we have available options that we are not just using, not because they are not good or because they have no value, but just because we are used to do things like we have always done. And the inertia to change is always present there. So a concerned effort to overcome that inertia is always a good point towards getting out of crisis in good shape. Would you, before I close, would any of you would like to say something else? Well, if not, I appreciate your time in the name of OIV and all the participants in this webinar. I thank you for coming forward, for sharing with us your experiences and for joining me in this discussion. I wish you well and hope to see all of you both here and in person very soon. Have a good one, take care, and to all our audience, thank you very much for being here today. Hopefully the OIV will host similar events in the future. Have a good day, evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonio.